I had a year of 2023 and I felt like I was being ghosted by everybody. And I mean, and I reflect on it a lot because you start to think about what you've done.
Welcome back to the In Good Company podcast. I'm Dr. Paul Sharp, Senior Lecturer at the University of New South Wales and researcher with UBC's Men's Health Research Program. In today's episode, we're jumping back into part 2 of my conversation with Dr. John Oliffe. John is a professor, Tier 1 Canadian Research Chair, and lead investigator of UBC's Men's Health Research Program. His work focuses on masculinities as it influences men's health behaviors. John's got some really interesting ideas on how men connect and interact with each other. So I want to get his take and unpack some specific social dynamics and behaviors like ghosting, throwing shade, and having off-the-record conversations. So the next bit I've got for you is kind of like a rapid fire round. I've got some topics, maybe some more narrow topics. We've been talking very, high level here. So keen to get your thoughts on some of these specific details, as I know, you have some opinions on these things. And I'm asking you now because some of them I don't understand. And I need you to explain to me what you mean by that.
We're in trouble now.
Yeah, right? Yeah. So, obviously a big part of this podcast, why we're doing this work, is around this piece of social connection, right? Talking about how men feel bonded to each other, how they build connections in their life, and the importance of those connections as influencing their mental health and well-being. You have, similar to me, had somewhat of an interesting relationship with both Canada and Australia. You have quite an intimate understanding of both, right? You've spent a lot of time growing up in Australia and you spent a lot of time in Canada. So you can kind of compare and contrast these two similar but different cultures of men. So what cultural differences have you observed between men in Canada and Australia? And are there any takeaways that you'd like to see adopted overseas, one way or another?
Big question. Just to say, I worked 22 years in Australia and I've worked 22 years now in Canada.
Okay.
So I couldn't even cure. And my caveat to my answer is that stereotypes ignore the effort. But I'll tell you what I think is the stereotypes.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So this is like a no-win moment for me, but
somebody's going to be mad.
I'm going to do it anyway. Someone's going to be like, "Oh,
yeah.
What a wanker!" And I'm like, so Australian men are very direct. I will say to people, I don't have a lot of intuition. You have to tell me what it is you're saying to me. You'll need to be direct, and I think, when we think about masculinities and when we think about building interventions, I think that tells us something about how we might want to appeal to somebody, to guys, in terms of helping them think about behaviour change, for example. And that directness it's honoured and it's part of what we would call the code, for how you communicate. So if you're going to say something, say it and be straight up with it. And oftentimes, we might say something before we fully thought it through and we're okay with a little bit of the processing of what goes on with that. Canada, by contrast, I think a lot of times, guys, there'll be a reservedness. And there's a real quality in that as well. They'll often sit back on you and kind of observe and watch and think, through things. They'll have opinions. You might not know them for years. It might take some time, to get underneath what is there. And it's a form of politeness and it's a reservedness. And it takes a while to scratch beneath the surface to get to that. So again, I wouldn't suggest that one is right compared to the other. I think what the message maybe is when you're building things in Canada, you probably want to be really switched on to that reservedness, and that you might not necessarily want to be totally direct about what it is. It might be something more like, oh, well, if you volunteer for this, you'll this would be a good thing for community. And then they get the social connection through it. Whereas Whereas Australia might be a little bit more like direct. Well, here's the outcome. Look at the outcome. This would be the honourable thing. Like, do this and you'll get this. And they're subtle differences, but they are cultural things. And again, stereotypes do ignore the effort and the diversity that's within that category of men within those countries.
Right.
But yeah, for me, it's super. There's such qualities in both approaches, but I think it's about knowing your audience, in particular places. And I think it's why some programs just don't translate. Like something that works in Oz might not bank in Canada, and vice versa. Like it's those, and I mean, obviously you've got some exposure too. I'd be keen to hear what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I did a bit of research on it back in the PhD, right? Looking at, how men perceive their mental health differently in those. And, we talked again more about the challenges and limitations of those cultures at the time. But there's an interesting piece around that tall poppy idea of not, you don't want to be the one to stick your head up and because you're going to get cut down. I didn't really understand at the time. And now that I've spent more time here, I get it. And so, it goes both ways. Like guys aren't showing off, right? There's not a lot of showing off your big truck or your expensive watch or these sorts of things here. It's all relative. But, it also means maybe if they do have a problem, they're not going to put their hand up either, right? Because they might feel like they could be ridiculed for that. So it's, as you say, it's very subtle differences, but I think the example of Starbucks not swinging it in Australia is great, right? So, they took over the world years ago and then they tried to just implement the same model in Australia, which already had a coffee culture. And it just fell flat. People didn't adopt it. And now the only place you'll ever find a Starbucks in Australia is in a big city and, near a touristy area. So I think that just goes to show how important understanding those cultural contexts are. Yeah,
absolutely. And I appreciate your point about the tall poppy piece as well. There's a humbleness that defines Australian cultures for sure. We're pretty we police it, and it's helpful to understand the benefits of that and also what else that kind of inhibits.
So my next question for you is around mentorship. And I think this is a really interesting piece because we talk about peer connections, right? And when you think of a peer, you often think of someone of similar age or a similar stage in life. You both got kids, something like that, as being relatable. I want to talk about mentorship. And then, I think it's interesting because I look to you as a mentor for my career, but also my growth as a man. I've taken lots of John-isms over the years and integrated those to various successes. And I know you've had tons of experience with mentoring students. So what is your take on mentorship and its role for guys in particular?
So just to say that I first experienced being mentored, it was two women at UBC. It was Joe Matoff and Joy Johnson. And I was pretty rough around the edges, still am. And they did a thing where they could see where I was going before I could see it. And it was so interesting. And so they never imposed views, but they would just kind of hang with you, and they knew that you would that I had the hard work ethic. And so that was just a matter of just channeling my energy or helping me sometimes just think about things a bit differently. So they'd drop these little comments and I'd be like, oh, okay. And it would take me 2 or 3 weeks to work it out, but the subtle messaging. And so I became super interested in how that worked because I knew it had changed my outcomes, because I don't think I would have enjoyed grant success as quickly as I did, or publication success, without their hands-on. So again, if you're thinking about mentoring, it's not necessarily, for me, it's not necessarily about saving people from their mistakes, because you can't a lot of times, but it's often about just subtly, mentioning something that they might hear and they might kind of act on and just kind of work with, and understanding that not everybody is the same. That you can't just be the coach that that rants and raves, like you're probably going to have to be the guy who adjusts to sort of for the personality that's there. And patience is massive, and that hasn't always been my virtue. And I have good days, bad days with that. I used to think that you picked the people that you would mentor, but the opposite I actually believe is true. I think people who want to be mentored kind of pick you in many ways. Like they kind of will come to you and go, can you, I'm just wondering about X, or I saw that you published this, or I saw that you did this, tell me about that, or I'm thinking about doing X, how does that line up? And I think guys, we talk about coaching, and I think mentoring may be a little bit more subtle. You got to help people just arrive at their own conclusions. And guys are good when they make their own decisions, or at least feel like they've made informed decisions. And sometimes when they poll you, they're not actually looking for you to answer it, but they are looking for some sort of sense that they might be in the right direction.
Yeah, I think that's a huge piece. And I think one of the things that you do so well that it sounds like you've taken from your mentors is you just drop the little breadcrumb. It's not about explaining everything and telling you what it is going to be. People kind of have to find that on their own. And I try and actively pick up on those breadcrumbs that you leave for me, because I've had that sense as well, especially early on in the postdoc days of like, you have a vision for, this or this project or, this year. And I'm just trying to pick that up and kind of follow it along to realize that vision. But in the end, it's not like it's written in advance by you. You're just nudging either way to help guide that path.
Yeah, and it's about momentum, and it's about, like you might take the different ring road, you might take an alternate route, and it works out being amazingly good for you. But it's just about forward progress.
Yeah.
So that idea about what's next. And I think for a lot of guys, that's key, that it's not like I'll never be in a place where I'm stagnated. And in our gig, in research, it's like, well, it's about discovery. So as long as you never ever lose that moment of wanting to know or understand something better than what you currently do, if that just continues to excite you, you'll always be all right. But again, sometimes you just need that forward progress about, I was reading this the other day, I thought it was really super interesting, and it might not drive you in that particular area, but you might go, yeah, I was thinking about X, and I can see an avenue that just might be an idea. So it's kind of fun, it's kind of fun just dropping those, and that's more just exchange. Like that's not even me being considered. I'm just happy to shoot the breeze, and things pop up, and it's kind of fun. It's the creative part of the research. Yeah.
So beyond the institution, mentorship as kind of a way that men connect. How common are these avenues for guys to get mentorship? I imagine vocationally, right? There's probably an aspect around that, maybe like illness management in specific contexts. But, I think it's definitely something that could be tapped more. If somebody's looking for a mentor just in life, what are your thoughts around how they might go about finding that, or where they might look for that?
If you like the way that someone does something, you can often ask them about, where that comes from, how they've thought about that. And so it's this informal mentoring. I think the blind spot in mentoring is that it's about reciprocity. So, I have young blokes, in my life that are family and things like that. They teach me enormous amounts, like just unbelievable things that I'm not exposed to, and they'll explain things to me. Got a nephew who's doing, engineering, and we have chats and stuff like that. And he shares things with me, and I'm like, just so interested, like, so he's mentoring me. And I'd say technology, as you get older and you get further away from every platform that, younger people might be on, sometimes when they orientate you to a few things that are going on for them, it's super important for you. Like, it's like, so there's an exchange in mentoring. So I don't think it can just be this one-way advisement. I think that you have to guys have got to feel like they've got some capital to offer, as well as some things to exchange,
So the next question that I have for you is around this idea of ghosting And I know you have some thoughts on this and how it relates to men. So maybe you could just give a bit of context around what ghosting is and why you think it has social relevance to guys in particular.
So, full disclosure, I had a year of 2023 and I felt like I was being ghosted by everybody. And I reflect on it a lot because you start to think about what you've done, and why that would be. And these weren't big ticket items. It was things like accommodation, storing a car, things like that, where I would get ghosted, and it was often on text. And, and I talk to my mates and they'll talk about, getting ghosted, like, having gone on a date and then not hearing from the person and stuff.
Right.
And I'm like, that would be hard. That's tough. And my point with the ghosting piece is often it's not about you. It's about the other person. It's potentially about a lack of being able to make a decision, an unwillingness to be able to commit to something, an arrangement for accommodation or a car or whatever, and so it's about trying to rechannel it and think about, well, I may have been ghosted, but it's about their behavior. And I think it's driven in some respect by people not wanting to offend. And I just would say that I think what we need to think about, especially in the texting kind of world, is that if you can't make a decision or you're not in a position to be able to say yes or no to something, then just say that, because I think it's better than not saying something, So the ghosting part has been just super interesting in that way. I think for guys, and I'll go back to like Simon Rice's, podcast with you, and he talked about rejection and, what's the worst thing that can happen? Rejection.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree, but guys take it really tough. Yeah. They take it mighty hard. And so this rejection, that you wouldn't honor, that text with some reply, even if it's the hard answer.
Yeah.
I think can be really tough on people. And I think guys can start to think, well, it's about me, it's something I've done, or is a pattern occurring. And if you think about the things that affect people in terms of their mental health, being othered, a sense of not belonging, a sense of burdensomeness. If you sent the text, you can see the 2 blue ticks and there's nothing coming back, and you're like, have I overstepped? What have I said? And I think can be really tough on guys. I'm sure it's tough on everybody. There's another piece to it as well that I would just say, because I think about it a lot, and I think I have primary friendships and secondary friendships. And so my expectations of being soft ghosted, or just that notion that someone might not be responding to me in real time, and it's all about text. It's about expectations, about working that out. So if I've got a sort of secondary friend and I text them and it's nothing urgent, then it might be a week, but I'm not worrying about it. It's not like I'm going, have I been ghosted?
Right.
And primary friendships, might be more responsive and, kind of live and things like that. And that's how it's set up. So again, it's trying to sort of work your way through that, about what actually is some sort of form of rejection or some sort of, element of being ghosted or not.
Yeah, it's interesting. We often always default to thinking it's something we did wrong. Did you go back, you read what you said, am I coming on too strong, right? Did I send too many messages? Am I taking too much of their time? Am I being too burdensome? And the reality of it, probably the vast majority of time, is it comes down to time. That person put their phone down, or they read it and then they intended to reply, but they walked away and forgot about it, or whatever that may be. Because I think for a lot of people, maybe guys in particular, but I think everyone, the social is often secondary to other things in their life, right? If the work is primary or their relationship is primary, the social piece is often the first thing that gets dropped when we get busy.
Yep.
And probably one of the biggest takeaways from this work that we've been doing is I feel like it would be valuable if we brought it a bit more to the forefront in general, just valued it a little bit more, valued those connections, making sure we reply. And I'm terrible for it. This is not me saying everybody should do things differently. I am absolutely terrible for it as well.
Yeah. I mean, your work is so interesting because, oftentimes, my limited look at the data that's in about, peer connection and, text comes up continually. And so, my understanding is that, if you send an email and you would never worry because it could be a week or a month and it's not an issue, but there's something immediate about the text that is almost like a phone call because we don't cold call. So it's easy to have those expectations set up, but I agree with you. I think it can be helpful to be kind of back to people and stuff. It's just high level communication and stuff, especially when something's time sensitive. But yeah, it's a challenge because I think the way that we operate in business, in our jobs, I think sometimes we're looking for some respite from how that's tied to the clock, again, and this idea that friendship and things are somehow more leisurely and less formal. But I think the truth of it is that social connection and being connected to mates and things like that is a ton of work, and that we need to just have the due diligence on it to keep it buoyant and live. And it often is a thing that we, might triage out because we are busy in these other aspects of our life, especially, if you're partnered and your primary linkage is looking after that relationship too, so those contexts, they really matter. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the next one is maybe a way of connecting, a strategy, if you will, that guys will often connect. And that is around throwing shade. Those insults to, maybe it's tall poppy, right? Maybe it's keeping people in line, but I think it's probably deeper than that. I'm notorious for making fun of other people, in a bonding sort of way, having a laugh, poking fun at someone. Hopefully they know it's not in a, hurtful way or whatever, but, having a little laugh, I think is a really good way of connecting. So I want to hear your thoughts on the idea of that banter, that shade that guys can throw at each other sometimes.
From an Australian cultural point of view, I grew up with it, and it's a way of inclusion. For the most part, it was never meant to hurt anybody. It was never about bullying. It was always about, just having fun with each other and, self-deprecating oftentimes as well would be thrown in. So it was kind of the normative was and it relates to the humbleness, so it keeps that structure flat because everyone's copping a bit of shade. And it's kind of part and parcel of how guys connect. I think, I think it works really well. I think at certain points it might, go the other way.
Mm.
If someone arrives super sensitive on other things that might be going on in their life and they cop one little piece of shade where it's, it's just not the right time for them and they might react and stuff like that, then usually that calls for an adjustment, in the milieu. That occurs, that does occur. But if someone meets that kind of aggression with aggression, then it can get quite awkward. So, yeah, I think shade is it can be quite embracing. It can be that you're brought into the group and you have a sense of belonging. So it can work that way. And then I think there's these disinclusions that occur, where people are kind of like not included in things that are activities that they might have been. And so again, some of that shade, I think, when we're talking about inclusion and diversity, I think sometimes, we can inadvertently throw shade where we're not really meaning to. We just sort of, kind of don't think to invite someone or maybe disinclude. So yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. Yeah.
So is that a part of masculine culture that you would keep going forward, or is that a progressive piece that we might cut out?
Well, it's friendly fire.
Yeah.
And it has been historically. I just think that, that friendly fire is great at one level, but I guess what we hope to do is get a bit more depth,
Yeah.
to kind of know, because most of us carry vulnerabilities. Well, we all carry vulnerabilities, and typically, the only time they're spoken about is when the resiliency is up and we, do the Hollywood ending at the end, and we sort of talk about how we're through that. So again, it's just trying to create the space that we can throw some shade, but also that when there's some stuff going on for guys in terms of their vulnerabilities, that we can also be a safe harbor and not take advantage of that, because it's very easy to perceive that might be the case, if you're a bit sensitive on something. So I wouldn't throw it out. I think it's well ingrained. It helps keep us humble. It keeps us, a level playing field at one level. But at the other side of it is that, we don't want it to be the dominance of a night out, where that's all that's happening. We kind and a friendship, and usually it's in groups as well. I'd say the one-on-one. I mean, you're probably not going to shade each other one-on-one. Because it's just going to be a stoush. So, it's one-on-one, you're probably not going to stay in that frame at all. You're probably not going to go there. But in groups, it kind of is a way of inclusion, disinclusion. Yeah.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing to reflect on because, I think you're absolutely right. It is in groups and it can be a posturing thing, positionality thing in the groups. And, that's when it's not going to be helpful, right? That you're trying to cut someone down to build yourself up. But it's a fine line on the topic and knowing the person as well. Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah. When it's done for hierarchies and done to establish pole position, it can be really damaging, because then it demands a performance to stay within that milieu, and that can be really tough on people. And then they make stupid choices. And that's where risk comes to the fore, and so that's really unfortunate when that happens. That's not friendly fire. That is creating a masculine hierarchy that really doesn't help blokes.
So the last piece that I want to talk about is it's in line with some of those insults that may be thrown back and forth, that some of them can cross a line to be not so politically correct. And there was this big conversation around, locker room talk with, Donald Trump's first presidency. I think, the things that guys say off the record. Again, I think it's a piece around bonding, right? That confidentiality, being able to kind of relate to each other in that way. There's a bit of a hierarchical, patriarchal piece there, I suppose you could see. Curious what your thoughts are on those kinds of off-the-record chats. Are they good or bad for men?
It's a really complex question. There's an opportunity to be authentic. And if it's not who you authentically are, then if you contort yourself to the group that's not really where you want to be, and you're saying and engaging things that aren't really you, then I think you've got to start to think about your values and your virtues, about who you really want to be. And that's not always easy, because, to turn the herd takes an enormous amount of work, and to drop out from the herd takes an enormous amount of strength, because you're going to be by yourself in it. So I think that perhaps the answer, and it's a bit of a like pleading the fifth here, but maybe it's about thinking about the milieus, and the culture that you want to be involved in. And maybe it's not, so much about the right and wrong, but, what exposures do you want? You might be saying less in particular forums that really aren't, your stick. You might be complicit in it. It's probably not perfect, but it might be better than being fully engaged in it. And then finding a way of maybe distancing yourself, and being in the circles that satiate you, that truly satiate you. So we contort ourselves, being complicit is not perfect, but certainly being part of it, if it's not really who you are, I think that's hard work. I think it's really tough on guys. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your conversation today. I think a lot of these things, especially when we talk about these little social nuances, are maybe things that we don't immediately think about in our day-to-day interactions. And, really diving into some of these topics can help to reflect on our own experiences and how we do things, what we do well, what we do not so well, and, how we want to be as a man, as a person going forward in those interactions. How do we want to present ourselves to the world? I think it's those kinds of reflections that can be incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I agree. And, for your work around peer, it's like, it's really complex terrain, to connect with someone in a way that, you can confide, you can, talk about the vulnerabilities and the things that are going on for you. But I think the things that we've mentioned and chatted about today, I think, they're checks and balances, right? About who you might connect with or why you might have a superficial relationship with some guys, because that's just where it is, and that's okay for that context. But I think those things, those ingredients, not every friendship's going to be that super winner where you can just, unleash it all and just, find that soft landing space. It's not always going to be like that. But I think some of those characteristics are certainly worth thinking about, for sure.
Thank you so much for your time, John. I think we earned that non-alcoholic beer now.
I'd say so, Paul.
Thanks everyone for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I'd like to acknowledge the New Frontiers in Research Fund for supporting this research project, as well as our team at the UBC Men's Health Research Program for producing the podcast. Be sure to check out the In Good Company website to learn more about men's social connection and peer support. You can find the link in the episode description. Also, please leave a rating and review on whatever podcast platform you're streaming from, as doing so will help others discover our show. Have a burning question or an idea for a future episode? We'd love to hear from you. Drop us a line at mens.health@ubc.ca. Until next time, I'm Dr. Paul Sharp. Thanks for listening.